Inside the Vatican listeners, Colleen here. As I'm recording this, Pope Leo is wrapping up his Africa tour in Equatorial Guinea. It's been an eventful and interesting trip, largely overshadowed in the English-speaking press by the back and forth between Donald Trump and his administration and Pope Leo. Both sides have sought to turn down the temperature in recent days, with the Pope telling journalists aboard the papal plane that it was not in his interest to debate Trump, and pointing out that his bold speech in Cameroon, in which he said the world was being ruined by a handful of tyrants, was written weeks before the trip, not in response to Trump's comments about him.
Much of what has been written since then has been more commentary on commentary, trying to interpret what has been said. It was looked at as if I was trying to debate, again, the president, which is not in my interest at all.
Vice President J.D. Vance responded on X saying he was grateful for the Pope's comments and that he believes the Pope preaches the gospel and that the Pope was in his prayers. Pope Leo is expected to give a press conference on his journey back to Rome on April 23rd, the day before this episode hits your podcast feeds, so stay tuned to americamagazine.org for reporting on that. And we're looking forward to hearing more from Jerry about this trip on next week's show. I also want to acknowledge that Tuesday, April 21st, was the first anniversary of Pope Francis's death. He was remembered with a mass and a ceremony at Santa Maria Maggiore, where he is buried, and where a plaque was unveiled commemorating the 126 times Francis went to pray there. Jerry has a report on Pope Leo's words in memory of Francis, and America has several thoughtful and heartfelt reflections on Francis's legacy. I'll link to a few of those in our show notes. For the rest of this week's episode, we're bringing you a conversation about Vatican diplomacy with the former head of the Vatican School for Diplomats, Archbishop Joseph Marino. This topic is especially relevant right now, as Pope Leo continues his push for peace, and as a Vatican diplomat, Cardinal Christophe Pierre, the Nuncio to the United States, was recently in the news for an unusual meeting he was called to at the Pentagon with Trump administration officials. Few details of that meeting have been confirmed, but what is clear is that the Department of Defense officials met with the Cardinal in the Pentagon on January 22nd, following Pope Leo's speech to diplomats decrying a spreading zeal for war. It's unusual for a nuncio to be summoned for a meeting with defense officials rather than State Department officials. Our interview with Archbishop Marino was recorded before those reports came out, so we won't touch on that story. But I hope our conversation helps give some context about who Vatican diplomats are, what they do, and what difference they can actually make on the world stage. After the break, my conversation with Archbishop Joseph Marino. Welcome back to Inside the Vatican with America Media. I'm your host, Colleen Dulle. Jerry and I have been talking a lot about war and the Vatican's pushes for peace in recent weeks. We often refer to Vatican Diplomacy, the network of ambassadors or nuncios around the world who represent the Holy See in other countries. They play a critical role in the appointments of bishops, but also in international relations. So today we wanted to take a step back and give you an overview of Vatican diplomacy, what nuncios do, where they work, and whether their work can really make a difference when it comes to peacemaking. And I can think of no one better to explain this than today's guest, Archbishop Joseph Marino. Archbishop Marino is a Birmingham, Alabama native who spent more than 3 decades as a diplomat for the Holy See, serving posts on 4 continents, including a mission to Washington on the eve of the Iraq invasion and a visit to Slobodan Milosevic during the Kosovo War. He later spent 3 years as president of the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy, which is the school that trains Vatican diplomats. So he knows exactly what goes into the work and training of nuncios. Welcome to Inside the Vatican, Archbishop.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
We are so glad to have you. So, first off, could you tell us a bit about your own path into Vatican diplomacy? Like, what drew you to it and what postings have you held?
Well, we're not really drawn to it. We are pulled into it, invited in. Yes. It's by invitation only, basically. I was a young priest in Birmingham, here in Birmingham at the cathedral. And one afternoon, the bishop called me. And he said, come see me. It was a Friday afternoon. And of course, when the bishop says, come see me, either there's going to be a new assignment or he wants to remind me about something. But anyway, I went to his house and he told me that he had received a letter from the Secretary of State asking if he would be willing to release me to enter into the diplomatic service of the Vatican, or technically the Holy See. And so he asked me to pray about it and to give him an answer in 2 or 3 days if I'd be willing to go. And I said, well, after talking to my spiritual director and reflecting and meditating on it, I said yes, and then I entered the academia in Rome for 4 years, and then my first assignment in 1988 was to the Philippines as the number 2 over there. I remember when I told my parents that this was going to happen and explaining about that I'd be living in different countries, and I don't think they knew about the diplomatic service of the LBC. I barely knew about it because I studied in Rome as a seminarian, and my mother said, "Oh, you're going to be a missionary going from one country to another." So,
Not exactly, Mom.
well, and of course, Pope Francis wanted us to embrace the missionary spirit of the diplomacy. He introduced that
Mhm.
missionary year into the formation of the student. So I said yes. I went to the diplomatic school in the Vatican. It's right there near the Pantheon, Piazza della Minerva, and it's been there since 1701. And we just celebrated our 325th anniversary in January with a wonderful celebration that I was able to attend. And it was 4 years, and then, like I said, my first assignment was the Philippines and Uruguay, Nigeria, Secretary of State, et cetera, et cetera. My first assignment as nuncio was Bangladesh. Pope Benedict appointed me nuncio to Bangladesh.
Do you have any sense why they picked you out of the priests of Birmingham?
No.
Got it. So, for listeners who might not be familiar with how Vatican diplomacy works, can you walk us through what it is that nuncios actually do day to day? And also, are there other kinds of Vatican diplomats who aren't nuncios?
Yes, we've had lay representatives in terms of representing the Holy See in diplomatic settings, but the primary one is, of course, the nuncio. The role of the nuncio or the Vatican ambassador is to be that constant and stable link between the Holy Father and the local churches. This was beautifully stated by Pope Paul VI in his document on the role of nuncios in the world, when he says, the Holy Father must be one with the local churches must be one with the Holy Father. And there are many ways that can happen. The Holy Father can send letters to the bishops. The Holy Father can visit the countries. But the stable and constant manner in which this is carried out is through the role of the nuncio. And I think this is very important to remember, that the Vatican diplomacy or diplomacy of the Holy See is fundamentally ecclesiastical.
What do you mean by that?
Fundamentally, this idea of the link between the local church, the particular churches, the dioceses, the conferences of bishops, and the Holy Father himself. Therefore, it is fundamentally ecclesiastical. Now, along with that is the diplomatic aspect, because the nuncio also represents the Holy See to a particular government. So there is that aspect. But I can tell you that in the day-to-day working of a nuncio in a nunciature throughout the world, I would say 90% of the work is particularly with the local church. As you mentioned, the appointment of bishops, of course, we have to be in touch with the government. We have to be in touch with the society in which we are sent. But the fundamental work is that constant relation between the local church and the Holy Father himself. So when governments decide to have diplomatic relations with the Holy See, with the Vatican, they are doing this fundamentally in the sense of a relationship with the Catholic Church. So it's a diplomatic relation with the spiritual authority, because it's not really diplomatic relations with the Vatican, that little piece of land in the middle of Rome, which is a state. It's a relationship with the moral authority of the Holy Father, called the Holy See.
Hmm. Yes, the Holy See versus Vatican is always a fun thing to try to explain.
We make it simple and say the Vatican, you know.
So, as the person who headed the Academia, as you called it, that's the nickname for the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy, where these nuncios are trained, would you say that like 90% of the training is on the ecclesiastical, the churchy stuff, or is a lot of the training more the diplomatic government relations side?
Well, the primary work up until recently, because the curriculum has changed a bit, or the implementation of the curriculum has changed a bit recently. Last year, Pope Francis signed the document updating, but all nuncios were having at least a license in canon law and a doctorate in an ecclesiastical discipline: canon law, biblical studies, biblical theology, dogmatic, whatever the student was studying and could study, and time to have the doctorate ready in order to be assigned at the end of so many years in the academia. Those courses take place in the different universities in Rome, the Pontifical universities like the Gregorian, the Lateran, Holy Cross, the Angelicum. So the guys go out in the day for those courses. But then we have internal courses, which cover the diplomatic questions, like the history of Vatican diplomacy. That would be one. Another one, international law, the different international conventions that countries are supposed to abide by. We have to know what those are, those kind of courses. When I was president and aware of Pope Francis dealing with the urgent question of migration, I introduced a course on migration and immigrants for the guys. And Father Baggio was teaching. He then became a cardinal.
This is Cardinal Fabio Baggio.
Exactly. And I also introduced a course on pedophilia.
Mm.
And that was being taught, and I think is continuing to be taught by Father Zollner, who's an expert in the question.
Right.
As the future representatives of the Holy Father in these countries, to deal with these two urgent issues, I thought it was very important that we have a background in that, in a formal way, in those two important issues. So the diplomatic courses are inside that building at Piazza La Minerva.
Got it.
And they are rigorous and important and extreme and fundamental for the formation of the diplomats of the Vatican. And at the end, before they are assigned, there's a little exam on those courses as well.
How many years of formation is that?
Well, it kind of depends on what degree you come into the academia. The minimum is 2. But if you, like I went in with nothing, no canon law degree. So I had to do canon law plus the courses in the academia plus the doctorate. So I did 4. That's kind of the maximum. The minimum is 2, the maximum is 4. Then of course, Pope Francis introduced the missionary year. So at the end of the formation, the preparation in the academia, and before an official first assignment, the students are sent to a mission country for 9 months to have that experience.
And in that, are they doing mission work? Are they like being pastors, or are they doing something that's more akin to a nuncio's work?
No, they're living in a local parish.
As someone who went through that training before, this new missionary year was introduced, do you wish you had had that experience?
Well, I had 4 years in a parish before entering. So the pastoral experience was there. As a young seminarian, when I was at the North American College, I spent a month in Calcutta working with Mother Teresa.
Wow.
Yes. So that was very dramatic. You can imagine I was 23 years old. So I did have some, and definitely I consider it very important. When we're in the nunciature, we're in touch with the local parishes. We're invited constantly to go say Mass for celebrations. Sometimes the nuncio is asked to do confirmations to help the local bishop. So it's very priestly.
We've had all of this talk about synodality, lay involvement in the church. Do you foresee a future where there would ever be lay nuncios?
Well, that's strictly up to the decision of the Pope, obviously.
That's a very diplomatic answer.
I would say there would be some questions, because if you are representing the Bishop of Rome, perhaps you should at least be a bishop.
Mm-hmm.
That's one argument, saying, well, it should be a bishop, an archbishop, actually. I think we have to be honest that there could possibly be some practical questions, because a layperson moving from one place to another with family, of course, other ambassadors do that. And I always admired that, how they move their families from one country to another. The kids have to start in another school, new friends. It's admirable. So that would have to be a serious consideration. We have had representatives of the Holy See at international conferences.
Right. I was thinking of Marianne Glendon. She represented the Holy See at a conference on women, an international conference on women, and she was sent to that, I believe, by John Paul II. So it's not, there are lay representatives of the Holy See at times. One thing I've also heard is that a benefit of having only priests as nuncios is that, they are able to devote themselves 24 hours a day to, this work in a way that somebody with a family, for example, might not be able to. Now, there's probably a conversation there to be had about work-life balance, but I wonder, that is also something that sets apart the Holy See's diplomatic corps. And I was wondering if you could speak to anything else that sets apart the Holy See's diplomatic corps versus other nations.
Well, like I said earlier, it's fundamentally inserted in the question of church, of who we are as church, this relation between the Holy Father and the local churches, and how we represent the Holy Father, and to get his message to the local people, and when we have to, when we are in touch with the government officials as well. The questions of diplomatic matters when it touches a local country, the first line of dealing with those questions belongs to the bishops' conference. The first line belongs to them to negotiate with the government if there's something, or to come to an agreement with the government. And the Holy See enters the picture when maybe a little help could be for both sides to move something forward. Now, of course, some countries have international agreements with the Holy See, like in Italy, the famous Concordat, and other agreements in other countries. I actually had to work on one when I was in Timor-Leste. At that point, it is the work of the nunciature to put that together, but in coordination with the bishops' conference, how they in the relation with the country and the church, with the government and the local church.
Okay, that's really interesting.
It's not that the Vatican imposes what it decides, what it thinks it should be. Of course, there's some fundamental questions that must be understood in these documents, like education, the freedom of the church to practice, liturgy, works of charity, financial questions, et cetera, et cetera. They're fundamental questions that all these agreements cover, but always inserted in the local context, how best to work that.
That really echoes something that Jerry's been saying a lot over the last few weeks as we've been covering wars, and kind of, especially in the U.S., the way that Pope Leo seems to be counting on the U.S. bishops to speak out, maybe even before he does. And I've always wondered how the diplomatic work fits in or weaves in with this, but it's interesting to hear from you that actually they're counting on the local bishops quite a lot.
Yes, yes.
I have a kind of procedural question, which is, in the kind of mediation with local government work, what's involved there? Is this like the Pope sending messages to the president via the nuncio? What actually happens?
Well, it probably depends on what the issue is.
Sure.
It would probably, maybe not exactly the Pope himself, but the Secretary of State, the Cardinal Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, or Archbishop Gallagher, who's in charge of the relations with states, with countries. Yes, sometimes there is an issue that might have to be, perhaps let's say there's going to be an international conference on climate change, and the Holy Father wants the governments to know what the position of the Holy See is going to be at these conferences. So perhaps we might get a document and say, please let the government know that this is our position, and if they can support. That could happen. I recall that happening on one, as I can't remember the exact issue.
One thing I've been wondering about, and I think many of our listeners are wondering about, is, the Vatican is very unique in like the geopolitical sphere because it is a player, but at the same time, it doesn't have, military interests. It doesn't have even very strong economic interests, right? It is primarily a voice for peace on the international stage. There's also, other things there, religious liberty, human dignity, etc. But as a voice for peace, I wonder, and the listeners have often asked me, does Vatican diplomacy make a difference? Are there any examples we can point to where it has made a difference?
You mentioned earlier about what are the interests of the Holy See in a particular country. I remember when I was the nuncio in Malaysia, and that's after Pope Benedict, they made relations between Malaysia and the Holy See. So I became the first one there. And when I went to one of the receptions, a Malaysian came up and said, "Oh, you're the ambassador from the Vatican." I said, "Well, what will be our trade with the Vatican? What do you have in it?" Because that's one of the key issues that diplomats deal with, because they're representing their countries. Paul VI, in that document that I mentioned earlier about the Nuncios, he said that the interests of Vatican diplomacy, the interests, what are we concerned about? The interest would be the people of the country to whom we are sent. That's our interest.
It's very different from the approach of many other diplomats.
Because diplomats obviously are representing the interests of their governments, and rightfully so. That's why they're there. And vice versa. That government has someone in the other country, and they're protecting their interests. They're trying to make their interests go forward and everything. Yes, but that's a very key line in that document. Our interests, unlike others, will be the people to whom we are sent to serve. In that, the call for peace, obviously, when the Pope mentions a call for peace, it gets people's attention. Like Pope Leo last Sunday, he got people's attention, and it was reported in the newspaper. What is the Holy Father saying about peace? What did John Paul II say about peace in terms of the Iraqi war? Now, Kosovo and all those other areas that he was very vocal about.
Mm-hmm. In some of those cases, you were sent to those places. I wonder what you could tell us about that.
John Paul II, actually, the question of Kosovo, if I was involved, because that was my duty at the desk. I was the desk officer of Kosovo at that time when the war broke out. And John Paul II was doing whatever possible and using all the diplomatic instruments available to him to stop the war in Europe. He was concerned about a ground war. He was concerned about the killing of people, innocent people, and all of that. And it was April 1st, I remember, he decided to send Archbishop Turan to Belgrade, and it was widely publicized, to speak to Milosevic to see if some type of peace could come. And since that was my duty in the office, I went along with Archbishop Turan and met with him and spoke to him, and he was well received, and he listened, and he said, "Well, let's try to make peace, everyone." In the meantime, and this was reported as well, he actually spoke to President Clinton on the telephone, John Paul II. And I think he was on the phone with President Clinton for almost 40 minutes, talking about what are the areas of peace. And of course, at this point, when you're talking to the Holy Father, you're talking with a moral authority. And when you're talking to Archbishop Turan in Belgrade, he's representing that moral authority. And that's where the strength of Vatican diplomacy is.
How do those leaders respond to speaking to someone who either is or who represents that moral authority?
Total respect.
Do you think it swayed them?
Well, Pope John Paul II was extremely concerned about a ground war in Kosovo. And if I recall, that never happened.
That's a good answer. We hear often about this famous meeting where Pio Laghi, the nuncio to the United States, went to Bush on the eve of the Iraq War and presented him a letter from John Paul II telling him not to invade. And I saw that was part of your bio as well. So I wanted to ask you about that time, especially because I mean, that is a time when, even if Bush respected the moral authority, he went ahead with the invasion.
One important fact about that meeting, Cardinal Laghi being sent by John Paul II, he was the only religious leader that President Bush spoke with prior to the war. So I would presume, I don't have any evidence, but I would presume there were many requests from other leaders to be welcome to the Oval Office and to speak about a war that was probably planned and ready to go. And he did. And again, since I hate to talk about it as but yeah, President Bush could not have been more gracious, more accommodating, more listening, but he did hear the message of the Holy Father in writing and through his representative, Cardinal Laghi.
The story I often hear is that he set aside the letter. Do you think that he read it?
Oh, no doubt he read it.
When people ask me about what difference the Vatican's diplomatic work can make, oftentimes what I think of is the reopening of trade relations between the US and Cuba. Because I know that the Holy See was involved in that, and various leaders credit the Holy See's involvement with making that possible. Are there other big examples of times when the Holy See has mediated something important like that?
Yeah, I could say I recall that there was a very important mediation between Chile and Argentina in the 1980s when there was a possible war because of a dispute with territory. And
Mm,
the Holy See was the mediator and the peacemaker in that situation.
got it. Archbishop, we're in a time of several different wars. Pope Francis often spoke of a third world war fought piecemeal. Pope Leo has constantly talked about war. And I feel like on Inside the Vatican every week, we talk about how the Pope is using all the diplomatic means that he can. Um, we've talked about several of these over the course of this interview, but you know, I wanted to ask you when we say that, when the Pope is pursuing all diplomatic means possible, what are those means?
Well, first of all, the Holy Father himself, when he speaks, when he especially after the Angelus or in other settings, the diplomacy of the Holy See, the head of our diplomacy is the Pope. He sets the tone, he sets the message, and that is the reference point for nuncios when talking to other ambassadors or talking with government officials. That those are the means. Discussing with the other diplomats at different moments, or whenever they meet other people, or let's say their governments. Sometimes governments will call in the ambassadors in the Foreign Office, or what we call the Secretary of State in the U.S., to speak about what the government position is on a particular issue, like what's going on right now. The nuncio would definitely be there, and if asked, would give the position or the words of the Holy Father of what should be done.
I had also read in Victor Gaitan's book about it's called God's Diplomats, but it's about Vatican diplomacy. Um, he writes about how because the Vatican, because the nuncios have kind of boots on the ground all over the world, the Vatican has an enormous amount of information that, may not be accessible to all other countries, right? And so it's a very, very valuable asset for that. And that is part of why so many nations want to be interacting with the Holy See. I wonder if you could speak to that. Is that true?
It's absolutely true, because we have access to the local people that maybe other diplomats don't. Our parishioners, our priests, our lay people, our bishops.
How would the Holy See decide what information then to share?
With others?
Yeah.
Well, whenever it talks about the dignity of the human person and safeguarding peace and what people are living through in a particular situation, that will be shared without any problem, that this is going on. And it's very clear, because that's what the Holy See is working for, to protect the human person from war, from suffering. And when the nuncio hears that from sisters who are teaching in a school, or lay people in their jobs, or priests in their parishes, parishioners coming to them, it's the purest information you can have.
And Archbishop, maybe to close us out today, you think back to maybe the last more than a century or so of popes, and there have been quite a few diplomat popes, but certainly not within my lifetime. And so I wonder, when you see Pope Leo ascending to the throne of Peter, he's obviously a canonist, as you are. He has emphasized peace from the very, very start of his pontificate. His very first words to the public as Pope. What stands out to you about his approach?
Yes. First of all, there's only been 5 popes who studied in the academy since 1701. The last one was Paul VI. So most popes have not studied in the academy. You asked about Pope Leo, and I'll say something about that. But when you think about John Paul II, when he became Pope, the Vatican or Holy See had diplomatic relations with maybe 60 or 80 countries, and when his mandate was over at his death, I think it had already grown to over 120, 140. I'm not sure, but it had almost doubled. People wanted to be in relation with him. And I think the same thing is happening with Pope Leo, that since the very moment he appeared as our Holy Father, the first word that came from his mouth was peace. And he said, peace to everyone. And I would bet that if someone did an analysis of every word he's spoken since that moment till now, the word that he might have used the most, or at least in the top 2 or 3, whatever, is the word peace.
Mm-hmm. Peace and unity.
Yes, peace and unity. So, and they're both how related they are. How can we have peace if we're not united? And how can we be united if we don't have a system of peace in the world? So I think the words of the Holy Father are very strong, very, very clear, very concrete, and very sincere. And that's his authority in the world today.
Archbishop Marino, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on Inside the Vatican, and I hope we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you for having me. God bless.
Inside the Vatican is a production of America Media. This week's episode was produced by Kevin Christopher Robles. To keep up with the latest news out of the Vatican, subscribe to America Magazine at americamagazine.org/subscribe. For America Media, I'm Colleen Dulle. We'll see you next time.